Welcome back to the Bible in Context, where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation. And this time we are finally to the end of chapter 5, where we're going to be talking about the roles of husbands and wives as relates to Christ and the church, which is the analogy that Paul uses here. And this is a hotly debated topic. Nate's not going to be with us this time. I really wish that he was, because of this very heated topic. Since this is such a heated topic, we want to, again, handle it with care, but also frame this in such a way that even if you don't agree with us, and you may not, that we can at least all respect one another's positions. This is something that is second tier, and yes, it is very important, but even still, this is not something to break fellowship in the church over. And so let's talk about this. Let's recognize that we can be on either side of this debate and still be brothers and sisters, still serve together, still evangelize together, and still be family. And that's what Paul has been striving for in this whole letter. But I still want to try to give a reasoned account of why we think the way that we do about this. So let's dive into the topic of men and women and their roles in their marriages. Fun stuff. Okay, so let's just set this up. This all starts not in verse 22, where the ESV, which is what we typically read out of, breaks the paragraph. Paul's instructions for wives and husbands is actually an outgrowth of the previous section. So let me begin back in verse 20, where Paul is continuing to encourage them to strive for unity within the church. And he says, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Okay, that is kind of the key phrase for the end of chapter 5 and through the beginning of chapter 6, is submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. The end of chapter 5, verses 22 through 33, talks about submitting to one another in the context of marriage. And then throughout the beginning of chapter 6, we see what it looks like to submit to one another in the context of parents and children. And then we see what it looks like to submit to one another in the context of slave and master. All of this should be framed under a discussion of submitting to one another. That's what Paul's getting at, and he's showing in this section, how do you do this in some particularly tricky situations, in some relationships that often come with a lot of complication and a lot of baggage? How do you submit to one another in these common environments? So I think that's why he picks wives and husbands, children, parents, slaves, masters. Those are some of the most common relationships you're going to come into contact with in your day-to-day. I mean, that's true for me. I have my wife, my kids, and my coworkers and my boss that I talk to the most, probably. And so it makes sense why Paul tackles these issues. Now, another aspect before we jump in here of what Paul is doing is he's showing how do we be honorable citizens in our context. This is very contextually rooted. That's true of all Paul's letters. And so he's showing how in our context it would be a representation of Christ through the relationships we have. How do we submit to one another and be unified and to reflect him out to the world in our current relationships? Paul is typically not in the habit of taking current social structures and dissolving them because there's something better. Rather, he's in the habit, is what we're going to see here, as with the slave and master that we'll talk about next time, is he's not going to dissolve that relationship. He's going to sanctify it. He's going to take it and make it the ideal of what it could be in the best situation rather than completely getting rid of it. Again, we'll talk more about that later, but I think looking at the slave-master relationship, that's one that a lot of us today would probably say, hey, that should be a relationship that is dissolved. Well, Paul doesn't go that route, and so keep that in mind as we talk about parents and children and wives and husbands. He's exercising the same mentality throughout this section, which all pours out of verse 21 of chapter 5 of he's explaining situations where we can submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. All right, so as we dive into verse 22, where we start talking about wives and then husbands, a little bit of background here on the place of women in Greek culture, because this is going to matter. Again, Paul's letters are very contextually rooted, and we need to understand where he is coming from so that his words make more sense, or at least make sense in their proper context. We can make them make sense in our context all day, but the wrong context will produce the wrong meaning. We need to understand the context. So, Greek women, they had some rights in this culture. but largely they were viewed as property, and they were in the charge of their fathers or their husbands. They had the ultimate authority within the household. And we have a lot of writings from philosophers and even from Josephus, who was a Jew. I believe Philo is similar, discussing how women are better suited for submission due to the superior rationality of men, and how women are inferior and less rational, and so therefore they are suited to be a second-tier citizen, to be submissive to the rational being, the man. That's prevalent among Greek and among Jewish thinkers of the time. Now, what's interesting, Paul doesn't base his roles for men and women in the inferiority of women and the superiority of men. Rather, he bases it in the relationship and the care and the love that Christ shows the church. So just sit back and think about that for a second. He's already breaking away from, for him culturally, to say that women are inferior, that's a live option for him culturally. I mean, that's a very popular and well-accepted thought. And so he could have said that, but he decides not to. That should be interesting. So should be something worth noting, and something we're going to come back to as we talk about this topic. So one more thing to note about the background is that Paul tells the wives to be submissive to their husbands, and culturally, that is the norm. That's what they're going to do anyway. And so the wives, they get 3 verses here, and the husband gets 8. That's often pointed out, but the reason that he does that is because he's telling the wives to do what they're already expected to do, but in a heightened sense, not just because, you're the inferior and you need to listen to your husband because he's the boss, because you need to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to your husband out of reverence for Christ, as though he were Christ. So just do what you're doing, and do it out of obedience and reverence to the Lord. And then he moves on to some other instructions to the husband, which are going to be potentially some more crucial instructions, I think. All right, so let's dive in. I'll read verses 22 through 24, and then we'll jump in here, because this is the section for wives. And so it says wives. It actually says women, but in this context, it's about wives and husbands. In the Bible, you don't really have a strict word for wife and husband like you do in English. It's more so man and woman, but that's her man and that's his woman. That's how you would talk about this. So in this context, this is about wives and husbands. So the translation is interpretive, but it's good. So wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. All right, now there's a couple different cruxes in the debate here within this short section. And the first thing to say before we jump into this, I know there's been a lot of prerequisite, I think, in this conversation, but this is a hefty topic. The first issue is the fact that this is about married men and married women. This is not about the relationship that men should have with all women, or that women should have with all men, only between a wife and a husband. So just keep that in mind. This does not apply if you're single. Having said that, let's jump into the first kind of crux in this debate, and it's the word head. The husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. So in a complementarian view, which is the view that holds men to be the head, they naturally take the word head here as head. He is the leader. However, on the egalitarian side, which views men and women as more equal, sometimes takes the word head to actually mean source. And I want to talk about that for just a minute. I don't really buy that translation. That doesn't end the conversation, but they take it to be source. And the reason is there is actually a text from ancient Greek about, I think, 400 to 500 years ago, before the New Testament was even written, where the term kephale, which is head, is used as source of, as in like source of a river. And that is actually listed in one of the major Greek lexicons. Problem is, that is a very rare occurrence in extant texts, and it's from 500 years before the New Testament was written. And so if that was a legitimate use, it seems to have fallen out of use by the time of the New Testament. And so what kephale actually means here is head. So Moises Silva has done one of the most in-depth studies on the use of the word kephale here, the word translated head, in the ESV. And he concludes that head is not typically used to speak of leadership, or the front of something, like the head of a spear being the point of it. Rather, he sees that in Greek literature, head more often denotes priority or preeminence in the context of honor. And so what we should be reading here is Christ is preeminent in the church, and the husband is preeminent over the wife. So that kind of, again, aligns more with the complementarian view. But the second crux of this debate is the man-wife Christ-church comparison something that is an occasional analogy that applies to this culture? Or is Paul saying it to be a universal rule for all marriages everywhere? Is he saying that Christ and the church's relationship is a good example for you to follow in your current relationship and culture? Or is he saying that Christ has created men to have headship in the marriage, just as he has headship in the church? Is this something baked into our ontology, or is it, again, an occasional analogy? Well, we'll come back and answer that after going through and looking at the husband's side. But something I do want to point out here is it is culturally true that men have more honor than women in Greek culture. Among most who hold the complementarian view, I don't think would say that women are ontologically less in honor. In the value system of Christ's kingdom, that men have greater honor and women less. That is what the Greek usage of head here would suggest, I think, if we take this as Christ has created the husband as part of his ontology, as part of his makeup. He is the head. He is greater in honor over the wife. Now, again, culturally, that's true. But we need to talk more about, is this a cultural statement or a cultural comparison, or is this about the way we are created? And if that's true of husbands and wives, does it mean that a wife is greater in honor before she's married? Is a husband less or more in honor before he's married? Again, we got to think through some of these things. So, real quick, a summary on women before we jump over to talk about men. Women are to submit to their husbands as to Christ. And culturally, they are already expected to submit. So Paul is encouraging them to do what they are already doing, whether they want to or not, but to do it in a Christ-like way, to do it in a way that honors him. That's what he's telling them to do. That's the instruction to women. Do what you're already doing. Submit to your husbands. Do it out of reverence for Christ. And okay, one more thing before jumping to men, because I know this will come up. In verse 22, where it says, wives, submit to your husbands, the word submit does not show up there. It's actually an inference from verse 21, where it says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives to your husbands. Wives do what to your husbands? Well, the inference from verse 21 is submit. I only bring that up because submit is the proper inference there. Again, that's another place where people who are debating about this, especially on the egalitarian side, will say, well, the word submit's not actually there. Well, it's like, well, yeah, that's true, but it's a really good inference from the previous verse. It's really not a good argument. So, and you can see here, I'm picking a bit on both sides of the debate because this is something that is debated so often. There are a lot of data out there, a lot of it misused, because this is a debate that scholars aren't just having. This is a debate that apologists and lay people are having, and so people who don't have the methodology to deal with some of these Greek terms and the way this literature works. And we need to make sure that we have that good methodology when we're looking at this. We're all trying to be faithful to the text. And that's great. That's exactly what we want. But let's try to do it right, and also not do it in a hostile way when we disagree. I think that's a big key here. This is a second tier issue. Probably can't say that enough in this episode. Okay, now, husbands. What are they to do? Wives are to submit as though they're submitting to Christ. Husbands are to love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now. There's more to this, but that's enough for us to talk about for just a second. Now, something just as an aside that's really cool in this is you almost get a picture of Ezekiel 16, where Ezekiel describes the Exodus as God finding this woman, and she's bloody, and he takes her in, he cares for her, he dresses her up, he makes her beautiful, and then takes her as a bride. You get very much that picture here. And we've talked about that passage, I think, quite a few times on the podcast because of that clear Exodus picture and the way that the Exodus is portrayed as completing the marriage of Yahweh and his bride Israel. So it's very cool seeing that in here. But the husband is to care for his wife in a similar manner as Christ has cared for the church. And ultimately, what is he doing here? There's a lot of exegesis that's reading very much into the actual actions that Jesus is doing, saying that the husband is to wash with the water of the word, to present himself in splendor, to present her without any spot or wrinkle, to make her have no blemish. And you can extrapolate that out into a lot of things. But ultimately, I think what Jesus is really doing here is he is taking the bride and he is loving her as himself, which that would make a lot of sense in the context since Paul says that multiple times, to love their wives, giving themselves up, and to love them as their own bodies, and to nourish and cherish it just as Christ does the church. What he's doing here, Jesus is taking the bride and he's increasing them in holiness, in honor, and giving them new life. He's making the church like himself in those respects. In those ways, he is loving his own body and taking care of them as he brings them close, makes them holy, as he makes them beautiful, increases their honor, and as he, through this kind of Exodus language, he gives them new life, the life that he has led the way in. So again, Christ is making the church like himself in a lot of respects. And what he's really highlighting is the intensity of the care that Christ has for the church. That is really Paul's emphasis here and what he's trying to encourage the husbands in. He's trying to increase the care they show towards their wives, of the love they have for their wives. And so what he's encouraging husbands to do here is to imitate Christ's action for his bride in the care and in the love that they provide for their wives and in the ways that they cherish and take care of their wives as though they were their own body. So a quick summary for what is going on in the instructions for the husbands is he is encouraging them to care tenderly and sacrificially for their wives as Jesus does. And now this is why these instructions might be a little more important in this culture. It was expected already for women to submit to their husbands. So he just says, hey, women, keep doing what you're doing, but do it in a Christ-like way. Hey, men, it doesn't really matter a whole lot culturally if you care for your wives. You're just in charge of them. And so he spends extra time saying, look how much Christ has cared for the church. I want you to care for your wives in that way, and really hitting this hard in showing the intensity which Christ loved his bride and which they're supposed to mirror. They need the extra encouragement because it's not expected of them. For women, it's expected of them to obey their husbands. And so he just gives them some rationale. The men need the extra encouragement to do what is right because culturally, doing what is right is optional. What he's trying to get out here is not set forth guidelines for marriage for the sake of setting forth guidelines for marriage. He's not just trying to write a treatise on marriage hierarchies. He is trying to explain, here is a complicated relationship, and here is a way that submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ fleshes out in this complicated relationship that is marriage. It's very practical. Now, in deciding whether or not this is a cultural analogy, again, is Paul saying, hey, the relationship between Christ and the church, he's the head of the church, and culturally, the man is the head, and so this is a relationship you should mimic? Is that a cultural analogy? Or is Paul saying that men being the head is the way it was supposed to be from creation, as that's the way we are made, and so this is a universal rule for every marriage? Which one is it? Well, a lot of people will go back, first of all, to Genesis. I encourage you to go back and listen to our Genesis 3:16 episode very early on in the podcast, because we look at the term teshuka, which is in Genesis 3:16, which is typically translated as your desire shall be for your husband and he will rule over you. But it's probably more appropriately translated as your submission will be to your husband and he will rule over you, highlighting just all the more that the hierarchy between men and women is part of the fall. It's either intensified in the fall or introduced in the fall, meaning that before the fall, before men and women trusted the snake and not God, they were either equal or at least more equal than they were after. Which, again, you see that playing out all throughout human history, but also, I mean, very much so in Israelite history, which they are the culture that gave us that book. So ultimately, you can't really use Genesis to argue definitively either way, but in either case, the hierarchy was less than it was before the fall, than it was after. It may have been non-existent. I don't think, the author of Genesis, I don't think he was so concerned in telling us that explicitly, so that's why it doesn't say definitively. Now, where else do we have anything in the Bible that talks about the headship of men and women? Because we need to bring in a larger context here to make a decision on this. And I'm not going to make a decision on everything in this episode, but I just want to bring in some larger context and talk about some of the other New Testament occurrences, and then those things can shed a light on this passage. So, where do we see women elsewhere in the Old Testament? What roles do they play? Some of this will be kind of tangentially related, some more related, but for instance, we have in the Old Testament we have the prophetesses Deborah and Huldah. In 1 Samuel 25, we have Abigail, who actually takes charge of her household and actually kind of undermines her husband, and she's portrayed as a hero for what she does. And we also have Isaiah 3:12. This is worth talking about because it's part of him describing the curse on Israel as they are being destroyed and forced into exile. And Isaiah says that women will rule over you. And so a lot of complementarian commentators will say that, well, see that women ruling over you, that is a reversal of order because men are supposed to rule. Well, actually, the majority of scholars recognize that that word is probably mistranslated there. It's actually creditors shall rule over you, meaning that they're all in debt slavery, which kind of fits the context there. But even if it is women here, yes, culturally, women were not kings, men were. And so within the Israelite and ancient Near Eastern culture, it would be a reversal of order. And again, that could be something very culturally rooted, not rooted in the way we were made since creation. So also in Romans 16:1, we have Phoebe, who is called a deaconess. She's a deacon. We have a majority of New Testament scholars now accept that Junia in Romans 16:7 was called an apostle. She was well known among the apostles. And then we have Acts 18, Prisca and Aquila. They both taught Apollos. A lot of complementarian commentators will say that, well, see, Aquila had a primary role and Aquila had an assisting role. That's not in the text, though. I guess you can interpret that if you're predisposed to think that way, but it's just not in the text. It doesn't really help us in the debate either way. I'm just bringing these up because they often come up in this debate. Now, interestingly, we have 1 Corinthians 7:3, where Paul says, "The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." And it's just interesting here. Yes, it's a particular context, speaking of not ruling the household, but their conjugal rights and relationship. Even in this, he gives the wife authority over the husband's body. And likewise, he has authority over her body. So there's a mutual authority here. It just seems strange that he does give the wife a manner of authority in this matter if he is trying to teach a complementarian view. And then also, one more thing to bring up is just 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul again says that men are the head of women, or husbands are the head of wives. But this is in the context of the instructions over head coverings, which most people today, not all, but a lot of people will recognize as this is something culturally rooted, that he is not trying to teach everyone that they need to have head coverings. But in this particular culture, it was important. And so he was showing them how to best represent Christ in their current culture. This is something very heavily embedded in its culture. Men are the head of women in ancient Greco-Roman culture. But again, this could all be cultural and not universal. And again, it actually seems in 1 Corinthians 7:3 that Paul is going against his culture and making men and women more equal than they are culturally. And that's actually what he does in Ephesians 5 as well. Because the cultural stance is women are inferior, men are superior and more rational, and so they are the head of the house. But rather, he takes time to seem to level the playing field a bit by saying, women, submit to your husbands, do it in a way that honors Christ. Husbands, not rule your wives, but love your wives, sacrifice for her, cherish her, care for her as you care for yourself. So the man kind of gets the greater challenge to change his role of headship to an opportunity to care, and women's role of submission as an opportunity to show reverence for Christ. Now let's go back to the slave and master relationship again in chapter 6, verse 5 is where it starts. Again, we'll talk about this more next week, but he tells the slaves to serve your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. And so here, he doesn't make the analogy quite as strong as he does with men and women, but he does use another analogy of our relationship to Christ to apply to slaves and masters. Now we know that people who are slaves and who are masters, that is a role that is not tied up with the way we are made. We are not perpetually made as slaves or perpetually made as masters, and it doesn't increase or decrease our honor in the value system of God's kingdom. I think likewise, that is what Paul is doing with the analogy of Christ and the church and men and women in verses 22 through 33. He's saying in this culture, men are the head of women. He's affirming that, yes, that's a fact here. In the same way, Christ is also the head of the church. So let's take that relationship and project it onto the relationship and use it as a model of what husbands and wives should be like in this culture. The Christ, church, and man-woman analogy seems to reflect the optimization of the roles of husbands and wives in this culture. They don't serve to describe the level of honor or the level of leadership that a certain sex is created to have, nor does it serve as a rule for the universal headship of all men over all women, but it serves as a model only for married men and women in a Greco-Roman culture. And recall that just as if a slave is no longer a slave and a master is no longer a master, the analogy that Paul gave no longer applies to them in that particular role. Likewise, if someone is not yet married or they go through a divorce or their spouse dies or something, this analogy breaks down. This is not about the way people were made, but as a model for broken people in marriages in a Greco-Roman context to model their relationship off of. And just as Paul doesn't say, hey, let's get rid of slaves and masters, instead, let's make it into something that can work, that actually respects everyone involved. That's again what he's doing here. Let's not break down the way that husbands and wives relate in a Greco-Roman culture, but rather let's just show people what this can be like if everyone loves each other and respects each other. It can be a good thing. He doesn't want to separate them from their culture, but to sanctify it and put the values of Christ into it, and then show others within that culture what it means to follow Christ in a way they understand. I mean, just practically, step back and think about that for a second. If Greco-Roman culture functions in this way, with husbands being heads and they're being slaves and masters, and then Paul comes along and he's like, yeah, get rid of all of it. Well, they see the Christians as undoing society. Instead, he says, hey, let's actually do this, but do it in a way that honors everyone and that honors Christ and the values that he has for his kingdom, just like they did in Israel, where if you look back in the Torah, they cleaned up the way that men and women interact and that masters and slaves interact so that it was a system that respected all parties and treated them all as the image of God. That's what Paul's after. That's why he does things the way that he does. Now, I've also got to say that this has nothing to do with the whole can women be elders debate. That's a whole another thing that's going to have to loop in what Paul says to Timothy. This is only about marriage. So just keep that in mind. We're kind of setting that aside for now. There's one last question that I want to ask before we get off of this topic and move on to the relationship of parents and children in chapter 6. And that is, what would it look like if Paul is actually shooting for men to be the head and women to be submissive? What does that practically look like? So is leadership a trump card for every family decision? Does it mean that the man is ineffective if he makes a joint decision with his wife? Does it mean that he has to give his stamp of approval on every decision that is made for the household? You kind of have to think through these things. And the way that this functions best, and in the past, my wife and I have leaned more on the side of complementarianism. But the more I look at some of these texts, at least within a marriage relationship, I think Paul, whenever he gets the chance to speak about men and women in a marriage relationship, he tries to level the playing field. He's speaking to women that are submissive already and men that are have freedom to do whatever they want and they're in charge. And he's saying, hey guys, slow down, care for your wives. Hey women, submit to them, and let's do it in a Christ-like way. Let's let everybody be Christ-like to each other. The whole point is mutual submission. In the past, we've held more of a complementarian view, and even in that, practically, things work best as joint decisions and as being a team, as mutual care, mutual love, mutual trust, not one person making every single decision or having the final and absolute say on everything. For some people, that may be how their marriage functions, and that may work. I mean, that's fine. And some people do that on principle. And again, that's okay. They are brothers and sisters. That's not how I am persuaded any longer. But I think what Paul is shooting for here is for men and women to be a mutually loving, caring, trusting team together, to be the image of God, the king and queen of creation, back in the garden. I think rather than taking the cultural ideas of superiority and inferiority that many believe began at creation, he just gives them a model of Christ and the church and says, hey, this relationship is kind of like this. Be like Jesus. In whatever relationship you're in, find a way that it relates to how Jesus treats us and try to follow that model. All right, so I'm sure there's still plenty to discuss in this passage. Again, if you have questions, comments, you want us to dig into something a little deeper about why we think what we think, send us in an email in the description or get on our Facebook page. Love to hear from you. But next time we'll keep moving on. We're going to pick back up in verse 31 and explain the mystery that Paul talks about there, since I didn't quite get to it this time. And then we'll jump on into chapter 6 and finish out that chapter. And then we'll take another episode to review what we've seen in Ephesians on a high level and see overall what Paul is trying to tell his audience once again.